From a very early age, perhaps the age of 5 or 6, I knew that when I grew up, I should be a writer. Between the ages of about 17 and 24, I tried to abandon this idea, but I did so with the consciousness that I was outraging my true nature and that sooner or later I should have to settle down and write books. I was a middle child of 3, but there was a gap of 5 years on either side, and I barely saw my father before I was 8. For this and other reasons, I was somewhat lonely, and I soon developed disagreeable mannerisms which made me unpopular throughout my school days. I had the lonely child's habit of making up stories and holding conversations with imaginary persons, and I think from the very start my literary ambitions were mixed up with the feeling of being isolated and undervalued. I knew that I had the facility with words and a power of facing unpleasant facts, and I felt that this created a sort of private world in which I could get my own back for my failure in everyday life. Nevertheless, the volume of serious, that is, seriously intended writing which I produced all throughout my childhood and boyhood would not amount to half a dozen pages. I wrote my first poem at the age of 4 or 5, my mother taking it down to dictation. I cannot remember anything about it except that it was about a tiger and the tiger had chair like teeth. I got enough phrase, but I fancy that the poem was a plagiarism of Blake's Tiger Tiger. At 11, when the War of 1914-18 broke out, I wrote a patriotic poem which was printed in the local newspaper, as was another, 2 years later, on the death of Kitchener. From time to time, when I was a bit older, I wrote bad and usually unfinished nature poems in the Georgian style. I also attempted a short story which was a ghastly failure. That was a total of the would-be serious work that I actually set down on paper during all these years. However, throughout this time, I did in a sense engage in literary activities. To begin with, there was a made-to-order stuff which I produced quickly, easily, and without much pleasure to myself. Apart from schoolwork, I wrote vers the occasion, semi-comic poems which I could turn out at what seems to me astonishing speed. At 14, I wrote a whole rhyming play in imitation of Aristophanes in about a week and helped to edit school magazines, both printed and in manuscript. These magazines were at the most pitiful burlesque stuff that you could imagine, and I took far less trouble with them than I would now with the cheapest journalism. But side by side with all this, for 15 years or more, I was carrying out a literary exercise of a quite different kind. This was the making up of a continuous story about myself, a sort of diary existing only in the mind. I believe this is a common habit of childhood and adolescence. As a very small child, I used to imagine that I was, say, Robin Hood and picture myself as a hero of thrilling adventures. But quite soon, my story ceased to be narcissistic in a crude way and became more and more a mere description of what I was doing and the things that I saw. For minutes at a time, this type of thing would be running through my head. He pushed the door open and entered the room. A yellow beam of sunlight filtering through the muslin curtains slanted onto the table, where a matchbox, half open, lay beside the ink pot. With his right hand in his pocket, he moved across to the window. Down the street, in a tortoiseshell cat was chasing a dead leaf, etc., etc. This habit continued until I was about 25, right through my non-literary years. Although I had to search, and did search for the right words, I seemed to be making up this descriptive effort almost against my will, under a kind of compulsion from outside. The story must, I suppose, have reflected the styles of the various writers I admired at different ages, but so far as I remembered it, always had the same meticulous descriptive quality. When I was about 16, I suddenly discovered the joy of mere words, that is, the sounds and associations of words. The lines from Paradise Lost. So he with difficulty and labor hard moved on with difficulty and labor he, which do not now seem to be so very wonderful, sent shivers down my backbone, and the spelling he for he was an added pleasure. As for the need to describe things, I knew all about it already. So it is clear what kind of books I wanted to write, insofar as I could be said to want to write books at the same time. At that time, I wanted to write enormous naturalistic novels with unhappy endings, full of detailed descriptions and arresting similes, and also full of purple passages in which words were used partly for the sake of their own sound. And in fact, my first completed novel, Burmese Days, which I wrote when I was 30 but projected much earlier, is rather that kind of book. I gave all this background information because I do not think one can assess a writer's motives without knowing something of his early development. His subject matter will be determined by the age he lives in. At least this is true in a tumultuous, revolutionary ages like our own. But before he even begins to write, he will have acquired an emotional attitude from which he will never completely escape. It is his job, no doubt, to discipline his temperament and avoid getting stuck at some immature stage in some perverse mood. But if he escapes from his early influences altogether, he will have killed his impulse to write. Putting aside the need to earn a living, I think there are four great motives for writing, at any rate for writing prose. They exist in different degrees in every writer, and in any one writer, the proportions will vary from time to time, according to the atmosphere in which he is living. They are sheer egoism, desire to seem clever, to be talked about, to be remembered after death, to get your own back at the grown ups who snubbed you in childhood, etc. etc. It is a humbug to pretend that this is not a motive and a strong one. Writers share this characteristic with scientists, artists, politicians, lawyers, soldiers, successful businessmen, in short, with the whole top crust of humanity. The great mass of human beings are not acutely selfish. After the age of about 30, they almost abandon the sense of being individuals at all and live chiefly for others or are simply smothered under drudgery. But there is also the minority of gifted, willful people who are determined to live their own lives to the end, and writers belong in this class. Serious writers, I should say, are on the whole more vain and self centered than journalists, although less interested in money. Aesthetic enthusiasm. Perception of beauty in the external world, or on the other hand, in words and their right arrangement. Pleasure in the impact of one sound on another, in the firmness of good prose or the rhythm of a good story. Desire to share an experience which one feels is valuable and not to be missed. The aesthetic motive is very feeble in a lot of writers, but even a pamphlet, pamphleteer, uh, pamphleteer or writer of textbooks will have pet words and phrases which appeal to him for non-utilitarian reasons, or he may feel strongly about typography, width of margins, etc. Above the level of a railway guide, no book is quite free from aesthetic considerations. Historical impulse. Desire to see things as they are, to find out true facts and store them up for the use of posterity. Political purpose. Using the word political in the widest possible sense. Desire to push the world in a certain direction, to alter other people's ideas of the kind of society that they should strive after. Once again, no book is generally free from a political bias. The opinion that art should have nothing to do with politics is itself a political attitude. It can be seen how these various impulses must war against one another and how they must fluctuate from person to person and from time to time. By nature, taking your true nature to be the state you have attained when you are first adult, I am a person in whom the three motives would outweigh the fourth. In a peaceful age, I might have written ornate or merely descriptive books and might have remained almost unaware of my political loyalties. As it is, I have been forced into becoming a sort of pamphleteer. First, I spent 5 years in an unsuitable profession, the Indian Imperial Police in Burma, and then I underwent poverty and the sense of failure. This only increased my natural hatred of authority and made me for the first time fully aware of the existing of the working class. And the job in Burma had given me some understanding of the nature of imperialism. But these experiences were not enough to give me an accurate political orientation. Then came Hitler, the Spanish War, Civil War, etc. By the end of 1935, I had still failed to reach a firm decision. I remembered a little poem that I wrote at that date expressing my dilemma. A happy vicar I might have been 200 years ago, to preach upon eternal doom and watch my walnuts grow. But born, alas, in an evil time, I missed that pleasant heaven. For the hair that has grown on my upper lip and the clergy are all clean shaven. And later, still the times were good. We were so easy to please. We rocked our troubled thoughts to sleep on the bosoms of the trees. All ignorant we dared to own the joys we now dissemble. The greenfinch on the apple bough could make my enemies tremble. But girls' bellies and apricots, roach in a shaded stream, horses, ducks in flight at dawn, all these are a dream. It is forbidden to dream again. We maim our joys or hide them. Horses are made of Cronian chromium steel, and little fat men shall ride them. I am the worm who never turned, the eunuch without a harem. Between the priest and the commissar, I walk like Eugene Aram. And the commissar is telling my fortune while the radio plays, but the priest has promised an Austin 7, for Dougie always pays. I dreamt I dwelt in marble halls, and I woke to find it true. I wasn't born for an age like this, was Smith, was Jones, were you. The Spanish War and other events in 1936 to 37 turned the scale, and thereafter I knew where I stood. Every line of serious work that I have written since 1936 has been written directly or indirectly against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism as I understand it. It seems to me nonsense in a period like our own to think that one can avoid writing of such subjects. Everyone writes of them in one guise or another. It is simply a question of which side one takes and what approach one follows. And the more one is conscious of one's political bias, the more chance one has of acting politically without sacrificing one's aesthetic and intellectual integrity.